Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's program for Monday, July 31st, 2023. This live online program is titled A Maker of Books, Alec Bolton and his Brindabella Press. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening. For those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with focus on the literature and the history of California and the West. Now, the book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition by becoming a member or a donor. Our membership dues are modest and the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without our members. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the book club. Now, let me introduce our speaker, Michael Richards. Michael Richards has been a secondhand bookseller, a librarian at St. Anne's College, Oxford, and the National Library of Australia. He's been a historian and a curator. He is a hobby letterpress printer and is the proprietor, printer's devil, and sole operator of the Ganges Press. In 1988, he curated the National Library's traveling exhibition for the Australian Bicentenary, titled People, Print, and Paper, celebrating the books of Australia, 1788 to 1988. Which was the first of a series of major exhibitions on Australian political and cultural history for which he was responsible at the library. Now, later, at Old Parliament House in Canberra, 1998 to 2012, he headed up historical research, site interpretation, and collection development, and was a senior member of the team which established the Museum of Australian Democracy in the building which had previously been the home of Australia's federal parliament. He began collecting Alec Bolton's Brindabella Press books in 1987, and in 1993 wrote a short pamphlet about him titled A License to Print, which was based on extensive interviews with Bolton. Michael Richards is also the author of A Maker of Books, Alec Bolton and his Brindabella Press, which is the subject of tonight's presentation. Now, Australia has a long history of fine printing, mostly little known outside of Australia. But tonight, you will hear about an Australian mainstream publisher and the hand-printed books he made for himself and his friends in the last decades of the 20th century, keeping alive letterpress skills that were being swept away by the constant changes in the printing industry. Printing is like religion, Alec Bolton once said. We live in sin, but with the hope of perfection before us. And while his life circled around books and writing, generally it was with his private press, the Brindabella Press, that he won acclaim as an Australian book arts practitioner from the 1970s until his death in 1996. Now, Bolton trained as an editor at Angus and Robertson, then Australia's leading publishing house, after a childhood in Sydney and wartime service in minesweepers in the Royal Australian Navy. Although he earned his living for most of his life as an editor and publisher, it was the production side of printing which came to dominate his creative life. So tonight, Michael Richards will be talking about the life and the creative career of Alec Bolton. Now, if you have any questions or comments for our presenter or about the presentation, please use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We'll have time towards the end of the hour to take questions and have conversation, and we'll curate the questions and comments that you have using that Q&A and the chat. So now it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Michael Richards. It's all yours, Michael.
Thanks, Kevin. I begin by acknowledging that I speak from the traditional land of the Gundungurra people and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you also to Kevin Kosick for his interest in Alec Bolton. Alec belonged to your club in the 1980s and gave several of his books to the library, as well as buying copies of some of its publications, including the facsimile of the bibliography of the Allen Press, whose work he admired, and BR, a record of a panel discussion about Bruce Rogers. The inspirational value of contacts with your West Coast printers is very important to me, he said when he renewed his membership in 1988. I myself am grateful to one of your most distinguished members, as it was the writing of Lawrence Clark Powell which inspired me to choose librarianship as a career. I never met him, but have tried to make up for that by collecting his work and now own many of his books. So who was Alec Bolton, and why should somebody write about him? Alec worked in publishing for most of his life and was responsible for many significant books in his career as a commercial and then as a government publisher, but it was his achievement as a private press printer which really marks him out among the men and women who make up Australia's book history. He came to hand printing in midlife, having trained as an editor, as Kevin reminds us, and for the first 15 years of its life, his Brindabella Press was a weekend activity. He once said perhaps he should have called it the month of Sundays press, because it took so long to get anything finished. He only had 10 years as a full-time printer, but in that brief time created a dozen lovely publications, working with a small group of highly accomplished writers, artists, and binders. His books were mostly poetry, which he and his wife, the poet Rosemary Dobson, believed in with a passion. He's widely recognised as one of Australia's most significant private press printers. It was a full bibliography I had in mind when I began researching this book, but I quickly discovered that there was a larger story I should tell. This was because Alec had created such a full documentary record of his press, which is held by the National Library of Australia. Trying to get to the next slide, which doesn't want to do.
Try to click your mouse.
Yep, that's it. Done. I thought there was a keyboard command that would do it. There are 13 manuscript boxes of his papers at the National Library, taking up nearly 5 metres of shelf space. Plus, of course, copies of all his publications, as well as relevant material in the papers of many other writers, including Rosemary Dobson herself, along with 7 hours of oral history interviews and many other related items. Because he'd kept such a detailed record of the production of every book, it seemed to me there was an opportunity to do far more than just describe them. Instead, I decided to use the books as the lenses through which to look at this well-documented press history. The book would become a bibliobiography with the primary focus on his private press, but with enough detail of the rest of his life to put that in context. The printer Giovanni Mardersteig of Officina Bodoni fame once said, and I quote, "Completed books go out into the world and are examined critically by bibliophiles and collectors. Few of them take into consideration through how many stages the pages of a book have to pass before they are brought together and make an entity meriting their attention. Nor do they realise how much the printer depends on the materials supplied to him, and how often these do not entirely meet his expectations and force him to solve unexpected problems." The language is gendered, but the point is nonetheless still valid. This was the final passage in his How a Book is Made, first published in 1929 and translated in 1980 by Hans Schmoller in his detailed account of the Officina Bodoni. In his new book, Only the Printer Knows, Martin Ould of the Old School Press cites Mardersteig as he in turn tells the story of his 10th book, Venice Revisited, one that was, quote, 5 years in the making, and a book that proved so fraught with difficulties that at one point I very nearly abandoned it. Telling such a story is something which might not be possible for many printers of fine books, as Simon Lawrence of the Fleece Press has remarked to me. And it's something which had not been done so extensively for any other Australian private press. So this is one reason for writing about Alec. I hoped also that the project might be useful because of the historical moment he occupied. Letterpress printing, once so dominant, may or may not survive into the future. The presses we use are mostly relics, old and often worn. The type we treasure, the inks we seek, and the paper we stockpile are all harder and harder to find these days. Photopolymer can substitute for lead type, but it's hard to find a digital substitute for the hand press. If letterpress does survive as a means of fine printing, it will be because printers like Alec Bolton bridged the transition from letterpress as the norm to letterpress as craft survivor, maintaining and extending classical traditions of excellence. The rush to newer, more cost-effective means of printing in the mid-20th century meant that many people threw the baby out with the bathwater. Alec is one who didn't. Alec Bolton was born in 1926 and grew up in Sydney, living first at Randwick, then a semi-rural suburb next to a racecourse. Here they are playing cricket on the lawn. The racecourse is still there, but the city now stretches much further out. He was born into a solidly middle-class family which valued education highly. His father was a ship's providore, and although he died when Alec was only 8, leaving the family in much reduced circumstances, Sydney Harbour was a constant in his early life. It was still a busy working port, perhaps a bit more crowded than usual on this day in 1932, when a crowd estimated at 750,000, most of the city's population, packed the shores for the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Alec travelled to school by ferry after he and his mother and brother moved to a small cottage in Hunters Hill, which is on the harbour, and as a young boy he spent many hours on the water in a much-loved canoe. Years later, he was to print a beautiful selection of Kenneth Slessor's Sydney Harbour poems, which he said was the book he was proudest of. And his love of the harbour is strongly present in his recollections of his childhood. He joined the Royal Australian Navy straight from school in the closing years of the Second World War and served on a minesweeper. However, despite his watery childhood, he turned out to be almost constantly seasick on board ship and decided to make a life on land instead. Once demobilised from the Navy and after completing an arts degree at Sydney University, he fell almost by accident into a career in publishing at Angus and Robertson. It was to be the foundation of the rest of his life. The cramped and paper-filled offices of Angus and Robertson were still the powerhouse of Australian publishing and bookselling in those days, although coming under challenge. Alec's papers include a series of photos of the editorial staff of A&R in the 1950s, rare documentation of a pre-digital world of publishing. Here we have, perhaps, Henry Mund, a Polish migrant to Australia who was to influence Alec with his views on typography, a photo which I think was taken by Alec, with galley proofs in the background in the other photo. Working next to the typewriter may be, but whose poem for prisoners was to be his penultimate publication half a century later. And here it is. And apart from being trained as an editor by the formidable Beatrice Davis, a figure of great influence in Australian publishing, who is generally considered to have been our first professional editor, here he met another young poet, Rosemary Dobson, who also worked in the small editorial team. This too is to be hugely significant for him. Like Alec, Rosemary had lost her father as a young child, leaving her mother in difficult circumstances. Her father was a son of Austin Dobson, the English poet and essayist, but the English Dobsons had no idea of how poor his widow and 2 daughters were until one of Rosemary's aunts visited Sydney. This led to a job at the Frensham School in Mittagong for Marjorie Dobson and free places at the school for the 2 girls. It was a good school and they were smart kids. Ruth, the eldest, would go on to a distinguished career as an Australian diplomat and was our first woman ambassador, while Rosemary became one of Australia's leading poets of the 20th century. It is difficult to do justice to her career in summary form. She wrote 11 volumes of poetry between 1944 and 2008, along with other works, including 2 collected works, compiled influential anthologies, was an officer of the Order of Australia and won many awards. Her poetry is still widely read and she has a large presence on the internet. And it was Rosemary who introduced the idea of private printing to Alec. Rosemary had printed her own first book of poems at Frensham School on a little Adana, and it was she who first suggested he think about becoming a hand printer himself. He recalled that quite early in their life together, Rosemary gave him a copy of Herbert Simon and Harry Carter's book, Printing Explained, 1931. A gift that had a long gestation, but which eventually bore fruit, although he never owned an Albion, the press this book describes. Now somewhat overlooked perhaps, it was in its day one of the best English introductions to printing for beginners, and it was perhaps the book she learned from at school. Rosemary was fascinated by typography and book design. She wrote poems about printing, one of which, Country Press, was much anthologised, and she even wrote a poem about the ampersand. Throughout the book, I've tried to show how completely Rosemary Dobson travelled with him through his journey as a printer. She was his key advisor, a partner in the development of the press's ambitions, and always an enthusiast for its work, although she constantly emphasised that it was above all Alec's creation. It was many years before the Brindabella Press was born, however. In the meantime, Alec and Rosemary married and raised 3 children. Rosemary left paid employment when the babies arrived, as was the norm, and Alec stayed on at A&R, where he played a major role in the production of the Australian Encyclopedia, a major achievement in Australian publishing history. This is not the place to go into the discordant history of the firm in those years, but after a change of management, Alec resigned on a matter of principle, and after a few months on the beach, as he put it, went to work for the publisher Sydney Ura Smith. Things got better at Angus and Robertson after an intense battle among share owners. It's a fascinating history. And in 1966, Alec was inveigled back and sent off to London to run their UK operations. It was here that he finally embraced letterpress, enrolling in night classes at the London College of Printing and forming the idea that he might start a private press of his own when the family returned to Australia. He recalled that it was visits to St Bride's Library which stimulated this ambition, and perhaps also talking to Richard Kennedy, an illustrator he commissioned to work on a couple of A&R titles at the time, and whose youthful memories of working at the Hogarth Press were about to be published as the first book of the Whittington Press. His own first publication dates from this period. It's a modest 1-page broadside, a poem by Rosemary called Colossus, printed in London on an Adana 8x5 in an edition of 24. As yet, his press had no name. In 1971, the family returned to Australia, but not to Sydney. They came to Canberra, the national capital, where he'd been recruited to establish a new publishing program at the National Library of Australia. And it is the National Library which has published this book to mark the 50th anniversary of the first fruits of that program. The first thing Alec printed in Canberra was a Christmas card, again modest, although he ventured into 2 colours. He named his press after the Brindabellas, a range of mountains along the border between the Australian Capital Territory and New South Wales, and a distinctive element of the Canberra skyline. This was the first use of his new imprint. Shortly afterwards, he bought a Chandler and Price 10 by 15 treadle platen, which remained his workhorse for the rest of his career as a printer, although he later acquired 2 other presses. I first met Alec when I went to work as a librarian at the library in 1986, which was the year he retired so he could print full-time, and I began collecting his books at the same time. By then, his Brindabella Press, also known as the Officina Brindabella, had won wide recognition. A little later, I wrote a short account of the press, which was published in 1993, which Kevin mentioned, some 3 years before his unexpected death at the age of 70. It still has value, I think, even though the checklist is now superseded, because it included a wide selection of photographs by Alec, a topic I'll return to. Rosemary was adamant that the press died with him in 1996, and after his death, his family disposed of his equipment, carefully selecting appropriate new homes for the presses, type, and paper. So what sort of printer was Alec? To begin with, he was not a hand press purist. He used relatively modern presses, those which he could find secondhand, and did not spurn mechanical inking, as he told Louis and Dorothy Allen when he visited them on his one visit to California, although he did use a hand brayer if the job needed it, as for example with his Barbara Hanrahan lino cuts. But he believed in relief printing for fine work, and as long as he could find it, was loyal to monotype, although when he had to, he reluctantly accepted linotype, and in the last few months of his life was moving to photopolymer. He liked illustrated books, preferably with wood engravings, and he worked closely with 3 of the leading exponents of that tradition in Australia, Barbara Hanrahan, Rosalind Atkins, and Mike Hudson. His early work, however, was most often illustrated with line blocks, with varying success. This reflected both the general absence of wood engraving skills in Australia at the time and his own background in trade publishing, even though he'd not been trained on the production side. The most successful of his early illustrated books was, I think, Occasions of Birds, poems by the Sydney writer Elizabeth Riddell, illustrated by Anne Weinholt, or Weinholt, I'm not sure of that pronunciation, a California-based artist who'd been at school with Rosemary and who was a lifelong friend. Weinholt moved to the US in 1945, and after working in New York, eventually settled in Marin, where she's possibly better remembered as a sculptor working in bronze. For this book, Alec had line blocks made from the drawings she did with a soft pencil, a technique he adapted from something he'd seen being done on a visit to the Whittington Press. And in another nod to California, the Centaur and Origi type he used came new from Mackenzie and Harris. On this occasion, the paper came from the US as well, as it was made at the Rising Paper Mill in Housatonic, Massachusetts. Although remote from the centres of letterpress excellence and influenced by British practice rather more, he was always interested in what was happening on the other side of the Pacific. Throughout the life of the press, however, his supply chains were fragile. There were few people pursuing what is still seen as a hugely quixotic enterprise in Australia, and the handful of widely dispersed Australian letterpress printers of his day always had difficulty finding supplies. Another early success, highly praised for its design in its day and now exceedingly scarce, was Time Given by James Macaulay. This is not it, by the way. It was the turning point of his early career as a printer, so I'll go into some detail here. It was the low standing of contemporary printing that Alec emphasised when he approached the poet in 1975 to see if he had any suitable work for publication by Brindabella, criticising the production of Macaulay's latest title. I've seen a copy of Music Late at Night and wish I'd been its printer. The poems are most beautiful, but the presentation is wretched, he said. Music Late at Night was a 48-page stapled pamphlet in Angus and Robertson's Poets of the Month series, an interesting attempt by the previously dominant publisher of Australian poetry to match the flood of cheap, offset-printed, small press formats characteristic of the new Australian poetry movement of the 1960s and 70s. But its printing was indeed undistinguished. Alec and Rosemary had been friendly with Macaulay for many years, and although they had little in common politically, it was Alec who'd suggested the name Quadrant for that influential Australian anti-communist literary and cultural journal of which Macaulay was the founding editor. But they did share strong views on how poetry should be printed. Macaulay replied to Alec's letter with the comment that it had taken, quote, almost 3 years to bring out one of the nastiest designs and productions that ever disgraced Australian publication, end quote. And he agreed to the suggestion of a Brindabella version. It would include all the poems from Music Late at Night with some new material, and at Macaulay's suggestion would be called Time Given. Alec admired the poems. He said, they're lovely. It's their crystalline quality that appeals to me, the sense that you've got down to the pure substance of what you're saying. I think they're very beautiful and moving, and I should be proud to print them. Alec was a discriminating reader and editor. He printed and published writing he admired. That was the point of all the effort. Printing Time Given was a race against terminal illness, and Macaulay died before it was published. Alec showed him pages as they were printed, and in an oral history interview later recalled holding his breath while Macaulay looked at them for a long time. Now that is very nice, he finally said. I was greatly relieved that he approved. Alec asked Rod Shaw, a Sydney commercial printer, to write handwritten display text for a book, quote, that is otherwise rather severe. These poems are very restrained and classical, he said to Shaw. They're not morbid, but some of them are written against a background of mortal illness. The notion of calligraphy was suggested by the love he shared with Macaulay of the Chancery Italic of Ludovico Vicentino degli Arrighi, an Italian Renaissance type designer and scribe whose letterforms were drawn on in the 20th century by several type designers, notably by Frederick Ward and Stanley Morrison for the Arrighi Italic designed to accompany Bruce Rogers' Centaur typeface. Both Alec and Macaulay had themselves adopted italic handwriting as adults. As for Shaw, Alec had long admired his work. Edwards and Shaw's books are lovely, with generous margins, conservative but elegant typography and good paper. The firm had begun as The Barn on the Hill, a pre-war private press set up in Sydney by Shaw and Richard Edwards, with only a handful of books completed before the war. Here are the first two, The Garden of Edens of 1939 and First Fruits of Australian Poetry, along with Shaw's calligraphic ornaments to a book published in 1958, after they'd become a commercial press. Alec asked Shaw to consider italic capitals suggesting plantain with flourishes. Shaw drew a great many alternatives for the title page and half titles and refused payment. Alec again printed with line blocks made from Shaw's calligraphy, producing a striking and original design. Although, quote, the printing of these small books takes me literally months and months of my leisure, as Alec commented to his binder for this next title, his commitment to book design, which allowed poems room to breathe, was absolute. Here, for example, is the contrast between his edition of Greek Coins, the first book he printed of Rosemary's poems, and its treatment by her usual publisher, where the same collection was shoehorned into 3 pages. A small book in an oblong format, illustrated by the author's own drawings of Greek coins, it was the first of 3 that Alec would print written by his wife. Here you can see with the arrow That's an entire page in the Brindabella Press Greek Coins edition. Alec soon moved on from these modest books, using wood engraving as his preferred form of illustration and hand binding instead of commercial case binding. His prices grew with his reputation, but remained astonishingly low. Although many of the books of the Brindabella Press now sell for substantial sums, and a complete collection will set you back several thousands of dollars, for Alec it was never about the money. He believed that, quote, "where a work of art is concerned, money may cease to have ordinary meaning," as he said in 1966, in the context of a controversy over the cost of the Sydney Opera House. All that counts is the work itself and the necessity of acquiring it. When he became a private press printer, he remained of the same mind. In the early years, all the books of his Brindabella Press either just broke even or made a small loss, even though he was investing more and more in their production as his ambitions and skills grew. He possibly made around $70 on the Exiled Immortal, a pamphlet written by Harold Stewart, which cost him 4 years of negotiation and heartbreak. Ironically, in the early years, it was perhaps his biggest profit maker. His horror when he discovered the author was asking recipients to change one word by hand was almost the last straw, but always the professional publisher that he was, he summoned resources of tact and diplomacy and negotiated a compromise. Stewart did admit it was his own mistake and not a typo. Times and Places, Alec's first hardback, netted $16.50, which went to the author. The book was the thing, not profit, and what mattered was that its makers, author, illustrator, printer, binder, were happy with it. "I'm trying to do books up to a standard rather than down to a price," he told poet Jeff Page in 1987. "That is what my subscribers expect," he went on to say. "The content of the book is my first interest, but after that the production has to come out right, and I'm not willing to work within price ceilings and limitations. At the same time, I'm not aiming at absurd prices." His next book by Rosemary was deeply personal and again marked his growing skill as a printer. One of her close friends was the poet and pastoralist David Campbell, with whom she co-wrote 2 books on Russian themes. After Campbell's death in 1979, Alec printed historian Manning Clark's eulogy for him, now one of the hardest Brindabella publications to find, and then a collection of poems by Rosemary, illustrated by his own photographs of Campbell's property, the Run, and of the south coast of New South Wales, which they all loved. As an aside, Alec was a lifelong photographer who in later years built up a substantial portfolio of photos of Australian writers as a gift to the National Library. They've been drawn on by many other publishers. Here, for example, is his photo of the novelist Kylie Tennant on the cover of her 1986 autobiography, published by Macmillan. With it is his photo of Marx and Company, which appeared on the back of first edition dust wrappers of Helene Hamp's much-loved 84 Charing Cross Road. From 1983 on, Alec mostly worked with wood engraving to illustrate his books. This, and a couple of years later, the development of a preference for craft bookbinders, marks his full transition to fine printing. His first engraver was the American Michael McCurdy of Penman Press, whose work he'd seen in the journal Fine Print, and with whom he'd been exchanging letters and books since 1976. But after that, his artists were all based in Australia. McCurdy engraved a frontispiece for a collection of poems by Dorothy Ochterlony, which Alec printed on his recently acquired Western Proof Press. The 3 wood engravers he worked with most often were Mike Hudson, Rosalind Atkins, and Barbara Hanrahan. Mike Hudson was a British artist who settled in Australia in exile from Thatcherism. He and Jadwiga Jarvis established the Waysgoose Press, one of the most interesting Australian private presses, and one which pushed the boundaries of what such a press could be far more than Alec did. Hudson was a wood engraver of consummate skill, who also worked as a photographer and graphic designer. The first title he illustrated for the Brindabella Press was Christina Stead, The Palace with Several Sides, 1986. Alec's Brindabella Press imprint had been trademarked by another Canberra printer, so this and the books that followed were published by the Officina Brindabella, although he was able to regain his preferred imprint in 1992. The book is a previously unpublished short story and came out after Stead's death, although Alec and Rosemary had become friendly with her towards the end of her life when she lived in Canberra. It is, as Hudson put it, a bleak little narrative, and he engraved haunting and powerful work in response. It's a small work in a wrapper-style limp binding by Robin Tate, with whom Alec worked several times. Many copies were bought by American libraries, incidentally. Hudson's major work for Brindabella was the Sea Poems of Kenneth Slessor, the book Alec described towards the end of his life as the one he was happiest with. Again, this was a posthumous work, as Slessor died in 1971, but he had worked with Slessor at the beginning of his career and shared a love of Sydney Harbour with the poet. This is a tall, handsome book with a lovely quarter leather and paste paper binding made by the binder, Helen Wadlington, another craft binder Alec worked with for many years. The major work illustrated for Brindabella by Rosalind Atkins was Les Murray's The Idle Wheel, a cycle of poems running through a year at Bunya, the poet's home in the New South Wales countryside. Alec arranged for artist and illustrator to spend time together at Bunya and carefully negotiated the relationship between artistic and poetic visions, an issue which he'd learned the hard way to be wary of. The Idle Wheel is a beautiful book, my personal favourite, with handmade end papers made from bladey grass, an Australian native grass. And finally, there was Barbara Hanrahan. Stay. Like Hudson, someone whose background and artistic vision was in many ways dramatically different from Alec's, but a highly skilled artist with whom he developed a great rapport. Their most ambitious project together was a boxed suite of 12 separate lino cuts, but they began with an edition of poems by John Shaw Neilson, chosen and illustrated with wood engravings by Hanrahan. Hanrahan was uncomfortable about illustrating anything other than her own work, but made an exception for Shaw Neilson, whose writing had been important to her since she'd been a teenager growing up in Adelaide. The Brindabella Press edition is a small but superb evocation of the work of this bush poet. He worked as an itinerant labourer for much of his life, who's now recognised as a significant Australian writer of the early 20th century. Alec came to printing in midlife and had only 10 years as a full-time printer after his departure from a busy, demanding job at the National Library in 1986 until his sudden death in 1996. Nevertheless, in those few years, he achieved a great deal. It's evident to anyone who looks at his books that Alec favoured the classical traditions of printing and book design he'd grown up with. He looked to letterpress and what it did best in an endeavour to print the best books he could, given his extremely limited resources. This was not out of a reactionary rejection of anything that was new, but was an endeavour to keep alive traditions of proven excellence, which were in danger of being lost in a world flooded with books produced cheaply by new technologies that had yet to prove their long-term value. Much as he admired the boldness of people such as Mike Hudson and Jadwiga Jarvis at their Ways Goose Press, their pushing at boundaries was not for him. Discussions about the difference between craft and art can be sometimes sterile, but there's a useful point to be made in that Alec was a crafts practitioner who worked within a clearly defined tradition. focusing at first on learning how to perform to its highest standards, and then on finding his own distinctive voice within the tradition. His early works were journeyman pieces, and then he moved on. The later books of the Brindabella Press were among the most beautiful Australian books of their era, made by a book artist of considerable significance. In 1993, the distinguished bibliographer Marcy Muir gave Alec a copy of her memoir of her husband, the bookseller and writer Harry Muir, with the words, "To Alec Bolton in friendship and admiration for the Brindabella Press." It's an attractive little book, printed by Jim and Ruth Walker at the Croft Press at Cobargo, and illustrated with some of the bookplates Muir commissioned from artists such as George Perrottet and Eric Fake. Her remarks on Harry Muir begin with a claim that I would repeat about Alec, and I quote, "Those who love books live in a state of constant anticipation and lively interest. It is a stimulating atmosphere. There is always the excitement of something fresh to look forward to, or some new book which may prove unexpectedly rewarding. Many of our friends loved books and enjoyed their life." Alec was one of these, a happy man whose achievement will long be with us. And writing this bibliobiography has been one of the great happinesses of my own life. I'll finish with details of where to get copies of the book, and also with the permanent URL for the full analytical bibliography of the Brindabella Press, which is somewhat summarised in the book. And again, many thanks to Kevin and the Book Club of California.
I have rejoined you. That was terrific, Michael. It was perfect in terms of the time and your pacing, and it was chock full of so much great information. I really appreciate you sharing this incredible but little known printer and book artist with the Book Club of California and with me. As you said, I was particularly interested when I found out about this book and the connections to the Book Club of California and the whole Bay Area book community. I mean, knowing that he was a member of the book club, donated a number of publications of his work to the book club. He has that association with the Allens and the association with M&H Type. It's kind of like a perfect connection on the other side of the world for us. So that's great. I'm going to remind folks that if they have some questions, now is a great time to put them in the chat and the Q&A. We're going to start taking some questions and the comments from there. So it'd be a perfect time to get your questions and comments in. I did also put the Booktopia link in the chat if you're interested in clicking on that and acquiring a copy of Michael's book. That's a great way to do it. You can also take it off of the screen that you have there. Let's see. There's some great questions in here. I also have 2 pages of questions of my own. So actually, I'm going to start with one of my questions first, which has to do with the research for your book. You had some great photos of Alec Bolton and his family and him at work. So where did you do the research to get those images and also find out about some of these great stories? Like I love the story about the author mistake of fruits and jewels. Like how did you uncover that story to share that with us?
Alec kept everything. I mean, going back to the photos for a start, a really significant source of the photos was the Bolton family. Rosemary died some years ago, but his children are still alive, and they have been enormously supportive, despite having very, very busy lives and very scattered lives. One lives in London, Ian's in Christchurch, Rob's in Sydney. But they're a close-knit family and were able to provide me with a lot of photos. There are other photos that have come from the papers at the National Library. The thing is, Alec kept just about everything. And then after his death, Rosemary and Karen Florence, who worked closely with Alec towards the end of his life, sorted the papers, and so they're in very coherent order. Alec had also sorted the first tranche himself, and they too are very coherent. So, for example, with Harold Stewart, I mean, I really did summarise the Harold Stewart. The chapter on the Harold Stewart saga is quite long, because the issue here wasn't just that Stewart found it very, very difficult to conclude his manuscript, and there's the difficulty that he's living in Japan. He was an Australian poet, but lived most of his adult life in Japan, in Kyoto, and Alec is in Canberra. They had an enormous amount of difficulty over the idea of illustrating that book, and Stewart kept coming up with either quite impractical suggestions that would have been impossibly expensive to print, that Alec just didn't have the technical capacity or the finances to do. He did then find an illustrator that he was very happy, a woman called Marianne Yamaguchi, who did beautiful drawings, line drawings and brush drawings, which Harold then rejected in the most brutal manner possible. And Alec actually, with Marianne's permission, kept them with his papers, because he said one day people will be able to see what Stewart's rejected. And you can now see them. So he was very careful. That relationship between author and illustrator bedeviled him throughout his career, and, well, not bedeviled him, but he learned that he had to be very careful, that writers were not necessarily immediately accepting of his choice of an illustrator, and illustrators were not necessarily immediately happy to just sit down and do something that was secondary to the written word. And that even turned out in the end to be an issue with Rosemary. And there's a moment where he has to say very embarrassedly to Mike Hudson, "Rosemary's rejected some of your drawings," and and they ended up using a frontispiece, even though Rosemary had enormous respect for Mike's work. She just suddenly realised that she wasn't comfortable seeing her poem turned into a picture. It had to be at a remove. So that was an issue that he learnt to negotiate very, very carefully, and he became very good at it. And he would send an illustrator off to meet a writer, pay for him or her to stay together for a few days, and develop a rapport. And I think that's one reason why the books worked so well. The images and the printing and the ideas in the books actually are in sympathy with each other. He did admit that it was much, much easier when he could do something like Kenneth Slesser, who was safely dead. And so it was, he could simply decide on an artist himself without having to negotiate with Slesser. But he preferred the living relationship. And I think that's one reason why they work so well. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an interesting question from Bill, who I think had to jump to dinner about the way he set the text early on. Seems that he mentions that it looks like it was set in sans serif early on in his early publications.
His
and
very first, the Colossus was set in a sans serif face, and that was the only time he ever did it.
Oh, is there a reason? Do you know if there is a reason for that, or just an aesthetic?
He doesn't talk about it. I think it's because that's printed in London. He'd just bought this little Adana. It may have been a face that he was able to borrow. He didn't own any in his later life that I've been able to discover. I mean, Baskerville, which he used most, is the most heavily used private press typeface pretty well. It's certainly up there with the others. And it was his favourite. But I think it just is the way it's what was available to him.
Yeah.
Printing on the kitchen table in London,
Mm-hmm.
in a rented house in Richmond, with the little press.
Yeah.
And after that, he very quickly, switches only to
Mm-hmm.
Baskerville and other serif faces. Yeah,
So possibly just a practical option, right?
I think
It
so.
sounds,
Or it was an
yeah,
experiment, and he decided, oh, actually, I'm not sure about that.
yeah, maybe it didn't
I
work.
didn't ask him about that when I talked to him in 1993, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not something that that I've come across him discussing anywhere.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about his connection or interest or the influence the Allen Press might have had on him?
I think he greatly admired the work of the Allen Press. As I said, he had the bibliography. He visited them, and the visit went reasonably well, although I don't think they approved of the fact that he used mechanical inking. He was quite happy to do that if because he on the Western he was able to set that up so that it printed, and of course with the Chandler and Price you print with the ink disc up above. Having said that, his major exposure to the work of other private press printers was to the British tradition. And this was partly because the National Library itself collected widely in that area in those years, but also because one of his closest friends was Bill Thorne. Bill was a very senior person at the National Library, and he was an extraordinary book collector and had a superb collection of Whittington Press, Old School Press, Old Style Press, a wide range of British private presses of the post-war era. And Alec would visit him and look at them. So Bill, for example, was a charter subscriber to the very limited edition of Matrix, the one with all the extras and specials and so on, from the Whittington Press. And Alec, I think, only ever owned a couple of copies of Matrix, but he would visit Bill and he would spend a lot of time looking at those books. And he made a few visits to Britain. He visited the Randalls at the Whittington Press. He visited Simon Lawrence at the Fleece Press a couple of times. So I would say the major influence on him and the major learning, I mean, there's one occasion where he actually directly copied the format, and I talk about this in the book, of a little flyer advertising forthcoming titles from the Fleece Press, and he did an exact equivalent for Brindabella Press, and that's the major influence, I think, coming from overseas. But what I've tried to bring out is it's always this, not quite a tension, but this melding of what was happening in the private press world and the traditions that he admired, that he'd grown up with as a printer. And when you look at the books that he published at the National Library, which I don't talk about in great detail in the book because that's a whole other book that you could write. Some of them have that very strong family resemblance to what he's doing. Very elegant typography, lovely wide margins, nicely bound so that they lie flat, which is something that he loved. And tall, narrow books. He loved tall, narrow books. They're lovely books on the shelf.
Yeah, I love tall, narrow books too. Who doesn't? That's a perfect segue though into two other questions. One, Linda was asking, can you tell us what presses he was actually working on? I know you mentioned one or two in there. And then more about the binders and the other artistic partners that he worked with. You mentioned already the kind of the illustrators, but who was binding his
Well,
work?
Helen Wadlington and Robin Tate do a lot of the work. His first craft book binder was Brian Hawke, and he only did one book with Brian. But what I talk about in the book is the way in which he got quite lucky in a sense, or he was just in the right place at the right time, because at about the time that his preferred commercial binder was retiring, and he was becoming a little bit unhappy with what was coming out anyway. It just happened to be that was the moment when a group of mostly quite young people started to set themselves up in Canberra as craft bookbinders, trying to make a living out of it. And they'd been they'd been studying in Ascona in Switzerland, they'd been studying in the UK. And so suddenly there was this group of people who had worked with really significant binders in Europe who were available here in Canberra. So he works closely with them for his subsequent books. Brian is the first, but after that it's above all Robin Tate and Helen Wadlington. And Helen's interested in things like making paste paper and so on. He also worked with Adrian Young, who was a very talented designer, book designer and graphic designer who worked at the ANU and then became an independent designer, who did things like the pattern paper on the one book that he did with pattern paper. So there's almost, Karen Florence has written an article about Canberra as a city of the book, a sort of a golden age in the 1980s and 90s, when suddenly there were a lot of these book artists in Canberra. And he was able to take advantage of that, even though at the same time he was losing access to things like freshly cast type. The sources of monotype were drying up. You know, he was getting type from Mackenzie and Harris because it was the only place he could get it in some instances. And one forgets this was a pre-internet era, and it was also an era in which Australia had strong protection laws. So he had to pay quite substantial import fees, bringing type into the country and that sort of thing, even though it wasn't competing. There was nobody casting type in Australia, or very few anymore. He even had Rosemary and Listen to bring some back in their luggage from California on one occasion at a literary festival. And, well, you drop by at Mackenzie and Harris and pick up some type. You know,
that's commitment. That's a heavy lift, literally.
He's very fortunate in that regard. He has constant battles over finding paper. There was one attempt to develop a handmade paper mill on the south coast of New South Wales, which didn't really work terribly well, although other people used their paper. So he had to find paper that was either commercially available or that he could import again at great expense and great trouble from the States, or in a couple of cases from Europe. So paper he becomes really obsessed with. And all this is, you know, you asked at the beginning where a lot of this came from. All this is documented in the papers. So all his correspondence, all his facsimiles, because this was the era long before email. And I'm quite sure he would have printed, if it had been an email era, he would have printed them out.
Printed it out.
But it's all there, and often photocopies of his replies. So you've often got a complete correspondence. The other thing about Alec, just as an aside, is that once he started writing to you, he kept going. So long after a book had been finished, he would maintain that epistolary friendship with somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are sequences of letters that go for 30 years, scattered through the papers. The other issue that he and his artists had was finding boxwood for wood engraving, which turned out to be very, very difficult. He experimented with some Australian wood. There was a problem in the period when he was importing boxwood from England. The major supplier was going through a difficult period, although I think that's sorted itself out. So for a long time, he's scouring the world for supplies of boxwood so that he can pass things on to his artists. And they are desperately searching for things. Type is a constant problem, and in the end, after spending a bit of time experimenting with linotype, which he didn't like particularly, because it was too hard to make corrections, and also the matrices that people had in Australia were becoming worn. He did buy some matrices from Canada on one occasion, a couple of occasions, but he was just finding it more and more difficult. So towards the end, right at the end, he had decided to go with photopolymer. And he was actually really enjoying that, learning how to design on a Mac. He produced one thing only, which was his last little newsletter on photopolymer. It was an article in the magazine Fine Print, which persuaded him that photopolymer was as good as lead type, because he said they ran an article which had the same passage printed by the two methods, and he said he couldn't tell the difference. It was as good as the other. So with his short runs, photopolymer was fine. So he had every intention of producing everything with photopolymer, and you could actually see in his letters about this. He's really excited at the possibility that it opens up for new typefaces, new sizes. Lead can be an enormous. There's that freedom of working within a very narrow compass, but it can also be very frustrating. You haven't got 14 point in that size.
Right.
You run out of the E's or the A's or whatever in a case. He, I think, was really looking forward to the liberation that photopolymer would have offered. And then he had a heart attack and died.
Yeah.
But he didn't.
We're past the top of the hour, but there's one last question which I want to get in here. Claudia asked it in the chat, but I also had it on my piece of paper, which is what is the current state of private press and fine art press in Australia, and are you hopeful for the future? Like, what's...
Absolutely. There are some wonderful presses. Google Fresh Lemon Press in Perth, in Western Australia, or Officina Athelstane in Rockhampton, where Derek Lamb is doing the most fantastic work. Karen Florence herself, with her imprinters, Ampersand Duck, is doing fantastic stuff. So, there are some really interesting young printers around.
Great.
Both here and in New Zealand. There are some really wonderful printers in New Zealand as well. As always, supplies are difficult, but we've now got the internet. I mean, when I set myself up, I bought my first press in 1987, but I couldn't find much to use it with. It took me a very long time to find a composing stick, for example. When I retired and got a bit more active, I was able to use the internet. I was able to scour the world and find things. There is a fantastic letterpress community around the world, and Australia is, in its own small way, part of that. We're scattered. You know, we don't have big annual ways-goozers because people are too far apart. But presses are treasured. There are people who look after them. There is, I would say, a thriving interest in letterpress amongst young graphic designers, especially. There's a strong connection to what's happening in the States, and a strong connection to what's happening in Europe.
Great. I'm putting one last time up in the chat information about the book, including the link for the booktopia.com.au for folks that want to grab that before we sign off here. Any last comments? Any last words you want to share about our subject tonight, about Alec Bolton, before we say goodbye?
Something I've said in a couple of other contexts is the thing about printing is that it is international. You know, we use our type, we get our paper, we get our ink, we get our presses from all over the world. And I think it's one of those things that binds the world together, even though sometimes the things that we print might divide us. So to me, printing is, and specifically letterpress printing, it's somehow in its sort of quotidian necessity, it's a wonderful exemplar of a world that is connected, and we need to understand that the world is connected. Alec, I think, understood that. And focused on printing as the thing that really mattered, but above all on the content of what he was printing, and you know, believing in poetry, believing in good writing, believing in good history. So I think that's something we should hang on to.
Inspiring closing remarks. I love it. That's great. So on behalf of the Book Club of California, I want to thank you, Michael, for joining us this evening from the other side of the globe for this presentation. And thank you everyone else out there in our virtual audience for attending this Book Club of California presentation. I hope that you'll join us for our next event. It's titled Companions of Minds and Books, H.H. and Matilda Bancroft in Their Literary Industries, on Monday, August 14th at 6 p.m. That's in a couple of weeks from now, 2 weeks from now. That's an in-person program here at the Book Club in San Francisco, but we will also be streaming it virtually on Zoom for a Zoom audience. And it will be a presentation by author and editor Kim Bancroft. You can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs, or using the link in any of the program emails that you might be getting from the Book Club of California. So please join us at our Book Club event soon. Thanks again for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be well and stay healthy out there. Thank you. And thanks, Michael. Have a great night.